1. The first inkling which Augustine Marchant had of the matter was on one fine summer morning about 3 weeks after his visit to Prague, that is to say, in June 1898. He was reclining, as is his custom when writing his poetry, on the very comfortable sofa in his library at Abbott's Medding, near the French windows, one of which was open to the garden. Pausing for inspiration, he was nearly at the end of his poem, Salutation to All Unbeliefs. He let his eyes wander around the beautifully appointed room, with its cloisonné and satsuma, Buhl and first editions, and then allowed them to stray towards the sunlight outside. And so, between the edge of the costly Herret carpet and the sill of the open window, across the strip of polished oak flooring, he observed what he took to be a small piece of dark fluff blowing in the draught, and instantly made a note to speak to his housekeeper about it. There was slackness somewhere, and in Augustine Marchant's house no one was allowed to be slack but himself. There had been a time when the poet would not for a moment have been received, as he was now, in country and even county society these days, even before the advent of the Yellow Book and the Savoy, when he had lived in London, writing the plays and poems which had so startled and shocked all but the decadent and the advanced, Pomegranates of Sin, Queen Theodora and Queen Marozia, the Knights of the Tour de Nesle, Amor Cypriacus, and the rest. But when, as the 90s began to wane, he inherited Abbott's Medding from a distant cousin and came to live there, being then at the height of an almost international reputation, Wiltshire society at first tolerated him for his kinship with the late Lord Medding, and then, placated by the excellence of his dinners, and further mollified by the patent staidness of his private life, decided that, in his personal conduct at any rate, he must have turned over a new leaf. Perhaps indeed he had never been as bad as he was painted, and if his writings continued to be no less scandalously free and free-thinking than before, and needed to be just as rigidly kept out of the hands of daughters, well, no country gentleman in the neighbourhood was obliged to read them. And indeed, Augustine Marchant, in his 51st year, was too keenly alive to the value of the good opinion of country society to risk shocking it by any overt doings of his. He kept his licence for his pen. When he went abroad, as he did at least twice a year, but that was another matter altogether. The nose of Mrs. Grundy was not sharp enough to smell out his occupations in Warsaw or Berlin or Naples, her eyes long-sighted enough to discern what kind of society he frequented even so near to home as Paris. At Abbott's Medding his reputation for being wicked was fast declining into just enough of a sensation to titillate a croquet party. He had charming manners, could be witty at moments, though he could not keep it up, still retained his hyacinthine locks by means of hair restorers, wore his excellently cut velvet coats and flowing ties with just the right air, half poet, half man of the world, and really had, at Abbott's Medding, no dark secret to hide beyond the fact, sedulously concealed by him for 25 years, that he had never been christened Augustine. Between Augustus and Augustine, what a gulf! But he had crossed it, and his French poems, which had to be smuggled into his native land, were signed Augustin. Augustin le Marchant. Removing his gaze from the objectionable evidence of domestic carelessness upon the floor, Mr. Marchant now fixed it meditatively upon the ruby-set end of the gold pencil which he was using. Rossell and Ward, his publishers, were about to bring out an édition de luxe of Queen Theodora and Queen Marozia, with illustrations by a hitherto unknown young artist, if they were not too daring. It would be a sumptuous affair in a limited edition, and as he thought of this, the remembrance of his recent stay in Prague returned to the poet. He smiled to himself, as a man smiles when he looks at a rare wine, and thought, "Yes, if these blunt-witted Pharisees round Abbott's Medding only knew." It was a good thing that the upholders of British petty morality were seldom great travellers, a dispensation of, Providence. Twiddling his gold pencil between plump fingers, Augustine Marchant returned to his ode, weighing one epithet against another. Except in summer he was no advocate of open windows, and even in summer he considered that to get the most out of that delicate and precious instrument, his brain, his feet must always be kept thoroughly warm. He had therefore cast over them, before settling into his semi-reclining position, a beautiful rose-coloured Indian sari of the purest and thickest silk, leaving the ends trailing on the floor. And he became aware, with surprise and annoyance, that the piece of brown fluff, or whatever it was down there, travelling in the draught from the window, had reached the nearest end of the sari, and was now, impelled by the same current, travelling up it. The master of Abbott's Medding reached out for the silver handbell on the table by his side. There must be more breeze coming in than he had realized, and he might take cold, a catastrophe against which he guarded himself as against the plague. Then he saw that the upward progress of the dark blot, it was about the size of a farthing, could not by any possibility be assigned to any other agency than its own. It was climbing up, some horrible insect, plainly, some disgusting kind of almost legless and very hairy spider, round and vague in outline. The poet sat up and shook the sari violently. When he looked again, the invader was gone. He had obviously shaken it onto the floor, and on the floor somewhere it must still be. The idea perturbed him, and he decided to take his writing out to the summer-house, and gave orders later that the library was to be thoroughly swept. Ah, it was good to be out of doors, and in a pleasance so delightfully laid out, so exquisitely kept, as his. In the basin of the fountain, the sea-nymphs of rosy-veined marble clustered round a Thetis as beautiful as Aphrodite herself. The lightest and featheriest of acacia trees swayed near, and as the owner of all this went past over the weedless turf, he repeated snatches of Verlaine to himself about svelte jet d'eau and sanglots d'extase. Then, turning his head to look back at the fountain, he became aware of a little dark brown object, about the size of a halfpenny, running towards him over the velvet-smooth sward. He believed afterwards that he must first have had a glimpse of the truth at that instant in the garden, or he would not have acted so instinctively as he did, and so promptly. For a moment later he was standing at the edge of the basin of Thetis, his face blanched in the sunshine, his hand firmly clenched. Inside that closed hand, something feather-soft pulsated. Holding back as best he could the disgust, and the something more which clutched at him, Augustine Marchant stooped and plunged his whole fist into the bubbling water, and let the stream of the fountain whirl away what he had picked up. Then, with uncertain steps, he went and sat down on the nearest seat, and shut his eyes. After a while he took out his lawn handkerchief, and carefully dried his hand with the intaglio ring, dried it, and then looked curiously at the palm. "I did not know I had so much courage," he was thinking. "So much courage and good sense. It would doubtless drown very quickly." Burrows, his butler, was coming over the lawn. "Mr. and Mrs. Morrison have arrived, sir." "Ah, yes, I had forgotten for the moment." Augustine Marchant got up and walked towards the house and his guests, throwing back his shoulders and practising his famous enigmatic smile, for Mrs. Morrison was a woman worth impressing. But what had it been exactly? Why, just what it had looked, a tuft of fur blowing over the grass, a tuft of fur. Sheer imagination that it had moved in his closed hand with a life of its own, Then why had he shut his eyes as he stooped and made a grab at it? Thank God! Thank God, it was nothing now but a drenched smear swirling round the nymphs of Thetis. "Ah, dear lady, you must forgive me. Unpardonable of me not to be in to receive you." He was in the drawing-room now, fragrant with its bank of hothouse flowers, bending over the hand of the fashionably attired guest on the sofa, in her tight bodice and voluminous sleeves, with a fly-away hat perched at a rakish angle on her gold-brown hair. "Your man told us you were writing in the garden," said her goggle-eyed husband reverentially. "Cher maître, it is we who ought not to be interrupting your rendezvous with the Muse," returned Mrs. Morrison in her sweet high voice. "Terrible to bring you from such company into that of mere visitors." Running his hand through his carefully tended locks, the cher maître replied, "Between a visit from the Muse and one from Beauty's self no true poet would hesitate. Moreover, luncheon awaits us, and I trust it is a good one." He liked faintly to shock fair admirers by admitting that he cared for the pleasures of the table. It was quite safe to do so, since none of them had sufficient acumen to see that it was true. The luncheon was excellent, for Augustine kept an admirable cook. Afterwards he showed his guests over the library, yes, even though it had not received the sweeping which would now be unnecessary, and round the garden, and in the summer-house was prevailed upon to read some of Amor Cypriacus aloud. And Mrs. Frances, nowadays Francesca, Morrison, was thereafter able to recount to envious friends how the poet himself had read her stanza after stanza from that most daring poem of his, and how poor Fred, fanning himself meanwhile with his straw hat, not from the torridity of the verse, but because of the afternoon heat, said afterwards that he had not understood a single word. A good thing, perhaps. When they had gone, Augustine Marchant reflected rather cynically. "All that was just so much bunkum when I wrote it." For 10 years ago, in spite of those audacious glowing verses, he was an ignorant neophyte. Of course, since then, he smiled a private, sly, self-satisfied smile. It was certainly pleasant to know oneself no longer a fraud. Returning to the summer-house to fetch his poems, he saw what he took to be Mrs. Morrison's fur boa lying on the floor just by the basket chair which she had occupied. Odd of her not to have missed it on departure, a tribute to his verses perhaps. His housekeeper must send it after her by post. But just at that moment his head gardener approached, desiring some instructions, and when the matter was settled, and Augustine Marchant turned once more to enter the summer-house, he found that he had been mistaken about the dropped boa, for there was nothing on the floor. Besides, he remembered now that Mrs. Morrison's boa had been a rope of grey feathers, not of dark fur. As he took up Amor Cypriacus, he asked himself lazily what could have led him to imagine a woman's boa there at all, much less a fur one. Suddenly he knew why. A lattice in the house of memory had opened, and he remained rigid, staring out at the jets of the fountain rising and falling in the afternoon sun. Yes, of that glamorous, wonderful, abominable night in Prague, the part he least wished to recall was connected, incidentally but undeniably, with a fur boa, a long boa of dark fur. He had to go up to town next day to a dinner in his honour. There and then he decided to go up that same night, by a late train, a most unusual proceeding, and most disturbing to his valet, who knew that it was doubtful whether he could at such short notice procure him a first-class carriage to himself. However, Augustine Marchant went, and, even to the man's amazement, deliberately chose a compartment with another occupant when he might, after all, have had an empty one. The dinner was brilliant. Augustine had never spoken better. Next day he went round to the little street not far from the British Museum, where he found Lawrence Story, his new illustrator, working feverishly at his drawings for Queen Theodora and Queen Marozia, and quite overwhelmed at the honour of a personal visit. Augustine was very kind to him, and while offering a few criticisms, highly praised his delineation of those two Messalinas of 10th century Rome, their long, supple hands, their heavy eyes, their full, almost repellent mouths. Story had followed the same type for mother and daughter, but with a subtle difference. "They were certainly two most evil women, especially the younger," he observed ingenuously. "But I suppose that, from an artistic point of view, that doesn't matter nowadays." Augustine, smoking one of his special cigarettes, made a delicate little gesture. "My dear fellow, art has nothing whatsoever to do with what is called morality. Happily we know that at last. Show me how you thought of depicted the scene where Marozia orders the execution of her mother's papal paramour. Good, very good. Yes, the lines there, even the fall of that loose sleeve from the extended arm, express with clarity what I had in mind. You have great gifts." "I have tried to make her look wicked," said the young man, reddening with pleasure. "But," he added deprecatingly, "it is very hard for a ridiculously inexperienced person like myself to have the right artistic vision. For you, Mr. Marchant, who have penetrated into such wonderful arcana of the forbidden, it would be foolish to pretend to be other than I am." "How do you know that I have penetrated into any such arcana?" inquired the poet, half shutting his eyes and looking, though not to the almost worshipping gaze of young Story, like a great cat being stroked. "Why, one has only to read you." "You must come down and stay with me," were Augustine Marchant's parting words. He would give the boy a few days' good living, for which he would be none the worse. Let him drink some decent wine. "How soon do you think you will be able to finish the rough sketches for the rest, and the designs for the coul de lampe? A fortnight or 3 weeks? Good. I shall look to see you then. Good-bye, my dear fellow. I am very, very much pleased with what you have shown me." The worst of going up to London from the country was that one was apt to catch a cold in town. When he got back, Augustine Marchant was almost sure that this misfortune had befallen him, so he ordered a fire in his bedroom, despite the season, and consumed a recherche little supper in seclusion. And, as the cold turned out to have been imaginary, he was very comfortable sitting there in his silken dressing-gown, toasting his toes and holding up a glass of golden Tokay to the flames. Really, Theodora and Marozia would make as much sensation when it came out with these illustrations as when it first appeared. All at once he set down his glass. Not far away on his left stood a big cheval mirror, like a woman's, in which a good portion of the bed behind him was reflected, and, in this mirror, he had just seen the valance of the bed move. There could be no draught to speak of in this warm room. He never allowed a cat in the house, and it was quite impossible that there should be a rat about. If after all some stray cat should have got in, it must be ejected at once. Augustine hitched round in his chair to look at the actual bed-hanging. Yes, the topaz-hued silk valance again swung very slightly outwards, as though it were being pushed. Augustine bent forward to the bell-pull to summon his valet. Then the flask of Tokay rolled over on the table, as he leapt from his chair instead. Something like a huge, dark caterpillar was emerging very slowly from under his bed, moving as a caterpillar moves, with undulations running over it. Where its head should have been was merely a tapering end smaller than the rest of it, but of like substance. It was a dark fur boa. Augustine Marchant felt that he screamed, but he could not have done so, for his tongue clave to the roof of his mouth. He merely stood staring, all the blood gone from his heart. Still very slowly, The thing continued to creep out from under the valance, waving that eyeless tapering end to and fro, as though uncertain where to proceed. "I am going mad, mad, mad!" thought Augustine, and then with a revulsion. "No, it can't be. It's a real snake of some kind." That could be dealt with. He snatched up the poker as the boa thing, still swaying the head which was no head, kept pouring steadily out from under the lifted yellow frill, until quite 3 feet were clear of the bed. Then he fell upon it furiously with blow after blow. But they had no effect on the furry, spineless thing. It merely gave under them and rippled up in another place. Augustine hit the bed, the floor, at last really screaming. He threw down his weapon and fell upon the thick, hairy rope with both hands, crushing it together into a mass. There was little, if any, resistance in it. Hurled it into the fire and, panting, kept it down with shovel and tongs. The flames licked up instantly, and with a roar made short work of it, though there seemed to be some slight effort to escape, which was perhaps only the effect of the heat. A moment later there was a very strong smell of burnt hair, and that was all. Augustine Marchant seized the fallen flask of Tokay and drained from its mouth what little was left in the bottom, ere, staggering to the bed, he flung himself upon it and buried his face in the pillows, even heaping them over his head, as if he could stifle the memory of what he had seen. He kept his bed next morning. The supposed cold afforded a good pretext. Long before the maid came in to relay the fire, he had called out to make sure that there were no traces left of what he had burnt there. There were none. A nightmare could not have left a trace, he told himself. But well he knew that it was not a nightmare. And now he could think of nothing but that room in Prague and the long fur boa of the woman. Some department of his mind, he supposed, must have projected that thing, scarcely noticed at the time, scarcely remembered, into the present and the here. It was terrible to think that one's mind possessed such dark, unknown powers, but not so terrible as if the apparition had been endowed with an entirely separate objective existence. In a day or two he would consult his doctor and ask him to give him a tonic. "But," expostulated an uncomfortably lucid part of his brain, "you are trying to run with the hare and hunt with the hounds. Is it not better to believe that the thing had an objective existence? For you have burnt it to nothing. Well and good. But if it is merely a projection from your own mind, what is to prevent it from reappearing, like the phoenix, from ashes?" There seemed no answer to that, save in an attempt to persuade himself that he had been feverish last night. Work was the best antidote. So Augustine Marchant rose, and was surprised and delighted to find the atmosphere of his study unusually soothing and inspiring, and that day, against all expectation, salutation to all unbeliefs, was completed by some stanzas with which he was not too ill-pleased. Realizing nevertheless that he should be glad of company that evening, he had earlier sent round a note to the local solicitor, a good fellow, to come and dine with him, played a game of billiards with the lawyer afterwards, and retired to bed after some vintage port and a good stiff whisky and soda, with scarcely a thought of the visitant of the previous night. He woke at that hour when the thrushes in early summer punctually greet the new day, 3 o'clock. They were greeting it even vociferously, and Augustine Marchant was annoyed with their enthusiasm. His golden damask window curtain kept out all but a glimmer of the new day, yet, as lying upon his back, the poet opened his eyes for a moment, his only half-awakened sense of vision reported something swinging to and fro in the dimness like a pendulum of rope. It was indistinct, but seemed to be hanging from the tester of the bed, and, Wide awake in an instant, with an unspeakable anguish of premonition tearing through him, he felt, next moment, a light thud on the coverlet about the level of his knees. Something had arrived on the bed. And Augustine Marchant neither shrieked nor leapt from his bed. He could not. Yet, now that his eyes were grown used to the twilight of the room, he saw it clearly. The fur rope which he had burnt to extinction 2 nights ago, dark and shining as before, rippling with a gentle movement as it coiled itself neatly together in the place where it had struck the bed, and subsided there in a symmetrical round, with only that tapering end a little raised, and, as it were, looking at him, only eyeless and featureless, it could not look. One thought of disgusted relief that it was not at any rate going to attack him, and Augustine Marchant fainted. Yet his swoon must have merged into sleep, for he woke in a more or less ordinary fashion to find his man placing his early tea-tray beside him, and inquiring when he should draw his bath. There was nothing on the bed. "I shall change my bedroom," thought Augustine to himself, looking at the haggard, fallen-eyed man who faced him in the mirror as he shaved. "No, better still, I will go away for a change. Then I shall not have these dreams. I'll go to old Edgar Fortescue for a few days. He begged me again, not long ago, to come any time." So to the house of that old Maecenas he went. He was much too great a man now to be in need of Sir Edgar's patronage. It was homage which he received there, both from host and guests. The stay did much to soothe his scarified nerves. Unfortunately, the last day undid the good of all the foregoing ones. Sir Edgar possessed a pretty young wife, his third, and among other charms in his place in Somerset, an apple orchard underplanted with flowers. And in the cool of the evening, Augustine walked there with his host and hostess, almost as if he were the Almighty with the dwellers in Eden. Presently they sat down upon a rustic seat, but a very comfortable one, under the shade of the apple boughs, amid the incongruous but pleasant parterres. "You have come at the wrong season for these apple trees, Marchant," observed Sir Edgar after a while, taking out his cigar. "Blossom time or apple time, they are showy at either, in spite of the underplanting. What is attracting you on that tree? A tit? We have all kinds here. Pretty, destructive little beggars." "I did not know that I was looking. It's nothing. Thinking of something else," stammered the poet. Surely he had been mistaken in thinking that he had seen a sinuous, dark, furry thing undulating like a caterpillar down the stem of that particular apple-tree at a few yards' distance. Talk went on, even his own. There was safety in it. It was only the breeze which faintly rustled that bed of heliotrope behind the seat. Augustine wanted desperately to get up and leave the orchard, but neither Sir Edgar nor his wife seemed disposed to move, and so the poet remained at his end of the seat, his left hand playing nervously with a long bent of grass which had escaped the scythe. All at once he felt a tickling sensation on the back of his hand, looked down, and saw that featureless snout of fur protruding upwards from underneath the rustic bench, and sweeping itself backward and forwards against his hand with a movement which was almost caressing. He was on his feet in a flash. "Do you mind if I go in?" he asked sharply. "I'm not feeling very well." If the thing could follow him, it was of no use to go away. He returned to Abbott's Medding looking so much the worse for his change of air that Burrows expressed a respectful hope that he was not indisposed. And almost the first thing that occurred, when Augustine sat down at his writing-table to attend to his correspondence, was the unwinding of itself from one of its curved legs of a soft brown oscillating serpent, which slowly waved an end at him as if in welcome. In welcome. Yes, that was it. The creature, incredible enough though it was, the creature seemed glad to see him. Standing at the other end of the room, his hands pressed over his eyes, for what was the use of attempting to hurt or destroy it, Augustine Marchant thought shudderingly that, like a witch's cat, a familiar would not, presumably, be ill-disposed towards its master. Its master. Oh, God! The hysteria which he had been trying to keep down began to mount uncontrollably when, removing his hands, Augustine glanced again towards his writing-table, and saw that the boa had coiled itself in his chair, and was sweeping its end to and fro over the back, somewhat in the way that a cat, purring meanwhile, rubs itself against furniture, or a human leg in real or simulated affection. "Oh, go! Go away from here!" he suddenly screamed at it, advancing with outstretched hand. "In the devil's name, get out!" To his utter amazement, he was obeyed. The rhythmic movements ceased, the fur snake poured itself down out of the chair and writhed towards the door. Venturing back to his writing-table after a moment, Augustine saw it coiled on the threshold, the blind end turned towards him as usual, as though watching. And he began to laugh. What would happen if he rang and someone came? Would the opening door scrape it aside? Would it vanish? Had it, in short, an existence for anyone but himself? But he dared not make the experiment. He left the room by the French window, feeling that he could never enter the house again. And perhaps, had it not been for the horrible knowledge just acquired that it could follow him, he might easily have gone away for good from Abbott's Medding and all his treasures and comforts. But of what use would that be? And how should he account for so extraordinary an action? No, he must think and plan while he yet remained sane. "Yes," said Augustine Marchant after a long pause. "Yes, it was a marvellous, an undying experience, one that is not given to many. It opened doors, but I despair of doing it justice in mere words." His look was transfigured, almost dreamy. "But she, the woman, how did you—" asked Lawrence Story in a hushed voice. "Oh, the woman," said Augustine, suddenly finishing off his wine. "The woman was only a common street walker." A moment or two later Lawrence was looking at his host wonderingly and wistfully. "But this was in Prague. Prague is a long way off." "One does not need to go so far in reality. Even in Paris." "One could have that experience in Paris?" "If you knew where to go. And of course it is necessary to have credentials. I mean that, like all such enlightenments, it has to be kept secret, most secret, from the vulgar minds who lay their restrictions on the finer. That is self-evident." "Of course," said the young man and sighed deeply. His host looked at him affectionately. "You, my dear Lawrence, I may call you Lawrence, want just that touch of, what shall I call them, les choses cachées, to liberate your immense artistic gifts from the shackles which still bind them. Through that gateway you would find the possibility of their full fruition. It would fertilize your genius to a still finer blossoming. But you would have scruples, and you are very young." "You know," said Lawrence in a low and trembling tone, "what I feel about your poetry. You know how I ache to lay the best that is in me at your feet. If only I could make my drawings for the two queens more worthy. Already it is an honour which overwhelms me that you should have selected me to do them, but they are not what they should be. I am not sufficiently liberated." Augustine leant forward on the flower-decked table. His eyes were glowing.
Do you truly desire to be?"
The young man nodded, too full of emotion to find his voice. The poet got up, went over to a cabinet in a corner, and unlocked it. Lawrence watched his fine figure in a sort of trance. Then he half rose with an exclamation.
"What is it?"
asked Augustine very sharply, facing round. "Oh, nothing, sir. Only I believe that you hate cats, and I thought I saw one, or rather its tail, disappearing into that corner."
"There's no cat here,"
said Augustine quickly. His face had become all shiny and mottled, but Lawrence did not notice it. The poet stood a moment looking at the carpet. One might almost have thought that he was gathering resolution to cross it. Then he came swiftly back to the table.
"Sit down again," he commanded. "Have you a pocket-book with you? A pocket-book which you never leave about? Good. Then write this in one place, and this on another page. Write it small. Among other entries is best. Not on a blank page. Write it in Greek characters if you know them."
"What? What is it?" asked Lawrence, all at once intolerably excited, his eyes fixed on the piece of paper in Augustine's hand.
"The two halves of the address in Paris."
3. Augustine Marchant kept a diary in those days, a locked diary written in cipher. And for more than a month after Lawrence Story's visit, the tenor of the entries there was almost identical.
"No change. Always with me. How much longer can I endure it? The alteration in my looks is being remarked upon, to my face. I shall have to get rid of Thornton, his man, on some pretext or other, for I begin to think that he has seen it. No wonder, since it follows me about like a dog. When it is visible to everyone, it will be the end. I found it in bed with me this morning, pressed up against me as if for warmth."
But there was a different class of entry also, appearing at intervals with an ever-increasing note of impatience.
"Will L.S. go there? When shall I hear from L.S.? Will the experiment do what I think? It is my last hope."
Then suddenly, after 5 weeks had elapsed, an entry in a trembling hand.
"For 24 hours I have seen no sign of it. Can it be possible?"
And next day.
"Still nothing. I begin to live again. This evening has come an ecstatic letter from L.S. from Paris, telling me that he had presented his credentials and was to have the experience next day. He has had it by now, by yesterday in fact. Have I really freed myself? It looks like it."
In 1 week from the date of that last entry it was remarked in Abbott's Medding how much better Mr. Marchant was looking again. Of late he had not seemed at all himself. His cheeks had fallen in, his clothes seemed to hang loosely upon him, who had generally filled them so well, and he appeared nervous. Now he was as before, cheery, courtly, debonair. And last Sunday, will you believe it, he went to church. The rector was so astonished when he first became aware of him from the pulpit that he nearly forgot to give out his text. And the poet joined in the hymns too. Several observed this amazing phenomenon. It was the day after this unwonted appearance at St. Peter's. Augustine was strolling in his garden. The air had a new savour, the sun a new light. He could look again with pleasure at Thetis and her nymphs of the fountain, could work undisturbed in the summer-house. Free, free! All the world was good to the senses once again, and the hues and scents of early autumn better, in truth, than the brilliance of that summer month which had seen his curse descend upon him. The butler brought him out a letter with a French stamp. From Lawrence Story, of course, to tell him what? Where had he caught his first glimpse of it? In one of those oppressively furnished French bedrooms. And how had he taken it? At first, however, Augustine was not sure that the letter was from Story. The writing was very different, cramped instead of flowing, and in places spluttering, the pen having dug into the paper as if the hand which held it had not been entirely under control. Almost, thought Augustine, his eyes shining with excitement, almost as though something had been twined, liana-like, round the wrist. He had a sudden sick recollection of a day when that had happened to him, quickly submerged in a gush of eager anticipation. Sitting down upon the edge of the fountain, he read, not quite what he had looked for. "I don't know what is happening to me," began the letter without other opening. "Yesterday I was in a café by myself and had just ordered some absinthe, though I do not like it, and quite suddenly, although I knew that I was in the café, I realized that I was also back in that room. I could see every feature of it, but I could see the café too, with all the people in it. The one was, as it were, superimposed upon the other, the room, which was a good deal smaller than the café, being inside the latter, as a box may be within a larger box. And all the while the room was growing clearer, the café fading. I saw the glass of absinthe suddenly standing on nothing, as it were. All the furniture of the room, all the accessories you know of, were mixed up with the chairs and tables of the café. I do not know how I managed to find my way to the comptoir, pay and get out. I took a fiacre back to my hotel. By the time I arrived there I was all right. I suppose that it was only the after-effects of a very strange and violent emotional experience, but I hope to God that it will not recur."
"How interesting,"
said Augustine Marchant, dabbling his hand in the swirling water, where he had once drowned a piece of dark fluff.
"And why indeed should I have expected that it would couch at his door in the same form as at mine?"
4 more days of new-found peace, and he was reading this. "In God's name, or the devil's, come over and help me. I have hardly an hour now by day or night when I am sure of my whereabouts. I could not risk the journey back to England alone. It is like being imprisoned in some kind of infernal half-transparent box, always growing a little smaller. Wherever I go now I carry it about with me. When I am in the street I hardly know which is the pavement and which is the roadway, because I am always treading on that black carpet with the cabalistic designs. If I speak to anyone, they may suddenly disappear from sight. To attempt to work is naturally useless. I would consult a doctor, but that would mean telling him everything."
"I hope to God he won't do that," muttered Augustine uneasily. "He can't. He swore to absolute secrecy. I hadn't bargained, however, for his ceasing work. Suppose he finds himself unable to complete the designs for Theodora and Marozia? That would be serious. However, to have freed myself is worth any sacrifice. But Story cannot obviously go on living indefinitely on 2 planes at once. Artistically, though, it might inspire him to something quite unprecedented. I'll write to him and point that out. It might encourage him. But go near him in person, is it likely?"
The next day was one of great literary activity. Augustine was so deeply immersed in his new poetical drama that he neglected his correspondence and almost his meals, except his dinner, which seemed that evening to be shared most agreeably and excitingly by these new creations of his brain. Such, in fact, was his preoccupation with them, that it was not until he had finished the savoury and poured out a glass of his superlative port that he remembered a telegram which had been handed to him as he came into dinner. It still lay unopened by his plate. Now, tearing apart the envelope, he read with growing bewilderment these words above his publishers' names. "Please inform us immediately what steps to take. Are prepared, send to France, recover drawings if possible. What suggestions can you make as to successor? Russell and Ward." Augustine was more than bewildered, he was stupefied. Had some accident befallen Lawrence Story of which he knew nothing? But he had opened all his letters this morning, though he had not answered any. A prey to a sudden very nasty anxiety, he got up and rang the bell.
"Burrows, bring me the Times from the library."
The newspaper came, unopened. Augustine, now in a frenzy of uneasiness, scanned the pages rapidly. But it was some seconds before he came upon the headline, "Tragic Death of a Young English Artist," and read the following, furnished by the Paris correspondent. Connoisseurs who are looking forward to the appearance of the superb illustrated edition of Mr. Augustine Marchant's Queen Theodora and Queen Marozia will learn with great regret of the death by drowning of the gifted young artist, Mr. Lawrence Story, who was engaged upon the designs for it. Mr. Story had recently been staying in Paris, but left one day last week for a remote spot in Brittany, it was supposed in pursuance of his work. On Friday last his body was discovered floating in a lonely pool near Carhaix. It is hard to see how Mr. Story could have fallen in, since this piece of water, the Mar de Ploven, has a completely level shore surrounded by reeds, and is not in itself very deep, nor is there any boat upon it. It is said that the unfortunate young Englishman had been somewhat strange in his manner recently, and complained of hallucinations. It is therefore possible that under their influence he deliberately waded out into the Mar de Ploven. A strange feature of the case is that he had fastened around him under his coat the finished drawings for Mr. Marchant's book, which were of course completely spoilt by the water before the body was found. It is to be hoped that they were not the only. Augustine threw the Times furiously from him and struck the dinner-table with his clenched fist.
"Upon my soul, that is too much. It is criminal. My property, and I who had done so much for him. Fastened them round himself. He must have been crazy."
But had he been so crazy? When his wrath had subsided a little, Augustine could not but ask himself whether the young artist had not in some awful moment of insight guessed the truth, or a part of it, that his patron had deliberately corrupted him. It looked almost like it. But, if he had really taken all the finished drawings with him to this place in Brittany, what an unspeakably mean trick of revenge thus to destroy them! Yet even if it were so, their loss must be regarded as the price of deliverance, since, from his point of view, the deliberate expedient of passing on his familiar had been a complete success. By getting someone else to plunge even deeper than he had done into the unlawful, for he had seen to it that Lawrence Story should do that, he had proved, as that verse in Genesis said, that he had rule over what had pursued him in tangible form as a consequence of his own night in Prague. He could not be too thankful. The literary world might well be thankful too, for his own art was of infinitely more importance than the subservient, the parasitic art of an illustrator. He could with a little search find half a dozen just as gifted as that poor hallucination-ridden Story to finish Theodora and Marozia, even if necessary to begin an entirely fresh set of drawings. And meanwhile, in the new lease of creative energy which this unfortunate but necessary sacrifice had made possible for him, he would begin to put on paper the masterpiece which was now taking brilliant shape in his liberated mind. A final glass, and then an evening in the workshop. Augustine poured out some port, and was raising the glass, prepared to drink to his own success, when he thought he heard a sound near the door. He looked over his shoulder. Next instant the stem of the wine-glass had snapped in his hand, and he had sprung back to the farthest limit of the room. Reared up for quite 5 feet against the door, huge, dark, sleeked with wet, and flecked with the bits of green waterweed, was something half python, half gigantic cobra, its head drawn back as if to strike. Its head, for in its former featureless tapering end were now two reddish eyes, such as the furriers put into the heads of stuffed creatures. And these eyes were fixed upon him in an unwavering and malevolent glare.